Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 1 of what I'm going to call the Concussion series. And in this series, we're basically going to break down different topics that I think warrant a little bit further of a discussion around concussion. So if you have topics around concussion that you think warrant a little bit further discussion, go ahead and drop them below, and I'll try to make a video around them. So I thought, what a great idea to start out this whole series by talking about what is a concussion and what actually happens to my brain whenever I get rocked. So my name is Dr. Matthew Shem. I am the owner of Peak Brain Performance Centers here in Colorado Springs. So without further ado, let's just jump right into it. And the first thing I want to talk about is some of the misconceptions that I hear surrounding concussion. And I think this whole slide probably warrants its own video in itself. But let's just touch on this and hit a couple of the big points. Is number one, that you have to lose consciousness in order to sustain a concussion. And while that can be, that you can lose consciousness whenever you have a concussion, the reality is less than 10% of people that have a concussion actually lose consciousness. So the vast majority of people don't. Number two is that you have to get hit in the head in order to sustain a concussion. And while that does happen, you can get hit in the head and have a concussion. It's probably the most likely thing to happen. It doesn't have to be the way. What can happen is obviously you get hit in the head, whether you're an athlete playing a sport or you fall and you slip on the ice and you hit your head on the ground. What can also happen is if you get hit in the body, whether you get shoulder checked or something like that, and a force transmits through your body and reverberates up to your head. Or something that's also really common is people who are in combat who are involved in these blast injuries where the blast could have happened a number of a large distance away, whether it be, sometimes it could be miles away. And that force just transmits and rocks your skull a little bit and shakes your brain a little bit. And that could lead to a concussion. Number three is that helmets prevent all concussions. Now, this couldn't be further from the truth, because if you actually look at the brain, and I'll show you a little animation later, but you can see that there's space inside of the cranial vault where the brain sits, inside of the skull where the brain sits, there's space that it can move around. So now if I go and put a helmet on, all I'm doing is basically protecting against fracturing my skull or something like that. You're not actually limiting the amount of motion that can happen inside of the skull. So number four is that rest is the only thing you can do. Many people have always been told from the beginning of time that the only thing you can do after concussion is just rest. And particularly a lot of people say is you got to rest in a dark room and just rest until your symptoms go away. That couldn't be further from the truth. And it's actually in the literature saying now that the sooner you start rehab, the better. And this kind of ties into the last point here, number 5, that this has to be your new normal. Once you have this brain injury, it's your new normal. You just have to deal with it. And while that may be true to an extent, whenever you're talking about more moderate to severe brain injuries, concussion falls under a mild traumatic brain injury. And so with these things, I've seen people who are just days after injury to years after the injury, and there's always progress to be made. Now, obviously, the sooner the better, but there is always progress to be made. So obviously, whenever you're coming in for rehab, when you're a couple of years down the line versus a couple of days down the line, you're probably not going to make as much progress as you could have if you would have started earlier. But even then, living the life that you're living years from now, that obviously brought you into my office to see me or another provider, you're looking for some sort of relief, no matter how minor it may be, right? So I think there's always a little bit of positivity to seek in this concussion world, right? Next thing. What is the prevalence of concussion? The CDC actually says that it can range from 1.4 to 3.8 million people who have a concussion, or million concussions per year. That's a lot of concussions. And I know that there's not a whole lot of providers out there who are adequately trained in being able to do this. And there's actually a study out there that I'll probably discuss later that's talking about there's medical residents who actually get diagnosis, management, and treatment of concussion completely wrong, and they just don't know what to do. So things to think about. Next thing, you can see that this gentleman looks like he just got rocked and now he's having a little bit of difficulty getting up. But talking about concussion stems from the Latin word concussio. meaning to strike together. And the definition or concussion is actually defined as a brain injury induced by either a direct or indirect biomechanical force transmitted to the head. So like we talked about earlier, you don't necessarily have to get hit in the head. Now that does happen. That's the direct force, or you have an indirect force like getting hit to the body that causes a force to transmit to the head. Then results in a reversible, and that's important, reversible clinical syndrome manifested as signs and symptoms affecting either physical, cognitive, emotional, and or sleep domains. So basically what we're saying is, and we'll touch on all the symptoms and signs later, just the more common ones, but this demonstrates the importance of finding a provider who is adequately trained in concussion, because there's so many different ways that a concussion can present. We have a saying that once you see one concussion, you've seen one concussion, right? And so every individual brain is different, every injury is different, and each presentation is going to be different. And so if you go to see somebody who say that they treat concussion and they offer the same treatment for every single person, you're probably in the wrong place. I would run away from that person, right? Because your brain is unique. And so a treatment for you should be unique as well, right? So diving into a little bit of the meat and potatoes here, what actually happens to your brain whenever you get hit? So this is what we call the neurometabolic cascade. And it's a big word, which basically is just talking about, you see here in the center of the screen, that white or gray thing is a neuron. And on the right side, you'll see that round area with the feet on it, that is what you call the soma and the dendrites. That's where information comes to the neuron. And then on the right side, you can see, or the left side, that going straight out, that's the axon. And that's the thing that sends the signal out to other neurons, right? So just like how I'm speaking to you, I'm using my mouth and you're using your ears to listen, and your ears transmit the signal to your brain to be able to process it and put it together and understand what I'm saying. So same thing here, that long stem that comes out of that left side, that is the mouth of the neuron that's speaking to other neurons. And that big white area and the feet are the ears and the brain of the neuron that's processing that information. So you'll see all these positive and negative ions all over the place. The negative ions on the inside, that's what a neuron is typically like. And the inside of a neuron is typically more negative on the inside. And on the outside is more positive. You have more positive ions on the outside. Now what happens is, whenever a neuron fires or transmits its signal to another neuron, these channels open and things start to switch, okay? So these negative ions go out, positive ions come in, and that's what leads to a signal being transmitted to the other neuron. The problem occurs whenever you have a concussion. What happens is these things start to happen on their own, okay? So these channels open up, all the positive ions flood in, the negative ions flood out, and this is happening, what they call a spontaneous depolarization, right? These neurons start depolarizing and firing on their own. And so now what happens is the brain has to work overtime in order to return everything back to neutrality. And this requires a lot of energy and a lot of nutrients to be able to get that job done. So just like if I were to go and run a marathon this afternoon, I haven't ate enough today to be able to supply enough nutrients for that task, but I also haven't been training to have enough energy to be able to do that thing, right? So same thing happens here is, for one, and it's kind of a, unfortunate situation that whenever you have a concussion, oftentimes you get this dysautonomic regulation or the autonomic dysfunction, where the autonomic nervous system is not working properly, and now you're not getting enough blood flow up to the brain to be able to supply this task, and you have to use this energy in the form of ATP to supply the brain, and particularly the pumps, to be able to pump all of these positive ions out and the negative ions back in, right? To get everything back to normal. So these pumps are working overtime to be able to do that job. And what you'll typically see is in that first 5 to 7 days, you'll feel your worst, where you feel the most symptomatic. All you want to do is sleep. And that is when the brain is working the hardest. That's when the brain is trying to get all these neurons to pump all the good stuff in and all the bad stuff out, right? Get everything back to how it was before. And it works its hardest for about 5 to 7 days. And then about 7 to 10 days, what happens is that's when most people will start to feel asymptomatic, or their symptoms will start to subside. Now, this is when we run into a little bit of the danger area, because in 7 to 10 days, I may feel asymptomatic. I don't feel dizziness anymore. I don't feel lightheaded or headache or nausea or anything like that. I'm no longer symptomatic, so I want to get back out on the field and start playing again. The problem is that whole repair cycle, the neurometabolic cascade, is not over for about 4 to 6 weeks. And so this is when you can run into things like second impact syndrome that we'll do another video on, which is basically whenever you go out on the field a little bit too early and you get hit again, what happens then? What happens to your brain then? And then what happens when most of the people that come and see me are months, even years down the line, and they fall into the category of post-concussion syndrome. And that will warrant another video as well. But that's whenever you make it past these 4 to 6 weeks and you still have symptoms, right? That's what they call post-concussion syndrome. Another thing to think about, and this is the animation that I was talking about earlier, whenever you get hit in the front of the head, you can see the brain kind of sloshes to the front and then it bounces back. And then in that bottom video, same thing, that you whiplash your neck. Your brain goes, hits the front of the skull, and then it bounces back, hits the back of the skull. And what they actually found was in this 1972 study, they took squirrel monkeys and they subjected them to pure translational motion. So either forward and back or side to side. And they actually found that it was quite difficult to sustain a concussion whenever that happened. However, when these monkeys were subjected to rotation, left and right like that, then all of the monkeys would end up being concussed, right? So we know that this rotational component is very, very important in regards to leading to a concussion, right? So another thing to think about is if you look at the shape of the brain is pretty round, right? And the head is pretty round. The skull is round. So the round brain sits inside of a round skull. And so whenever I go forward, it's not just going to hit and then go back, kind of like that bottom example is giving. It goes forward, hits the front, and then goes back. What actually happens is it goes, hits the front, and then it rotates a little bit, and then it comes back, and then it rotates a little bit more. And why that's important is if you think about the brain stem, the brain sits on top of the brain stem, and the brain stem turns into the spinal cord, which attaches into the vertebral column, and then all the way down it anchors into the pelvis. So it's kind of like this long, tight rope that the brain sits on top of. And whenever the brain goes forward and it hits, it rotates, and it causes a lot of torsion on that brainstem. So just like a wet towel, if I wring out a wet towel, the center part of that towel is going to get wrung out the most, right? So same thing happens here in the brainstem, is these center midline structures in the brainstem end up becoming very vulnerable to this stretching and shearing to occur. And that's where you start to get dysfunction. And where it leads people to be frustrated oftentimes is oftentimes, the patients that come and see me, they've already had imaging done because they've been struggling for a while. And everybody's told them that their imaging is normal. And while it can be frustrating to learn that the imaging is normal, but you don't feel normal, I always tell people that it's an important aspect of care, because basically we're ruling out that anything major has occurred, right? If you have a concussion or some sort of brain injury and you get imaging done and they tell you, well, your brain looks normal, it can frustrate you, but it's also important to think about that's a good thing to know that there's nothing major that is wrong with me, right? There's things that are reversible. And why you're not seeing any of this on imaging is because basically you're just taking these neurons and you're stretching them, right? And you're not actually causing damage, you're just stretching them, and they just become dysfunctional. So things to think about is, remember we talked about that midline structure that gets torsion and ripped and stretched, right? So this center part of your brain brain stem called the vestibular nuclei is a really, really important area that we often examine during the exam, right? And it's important because humans are designed to move, okay? And if I want to move, I first have to know my current location, right? I have to know where all my limbs are to be able to coordinate the appropriate task. Just like if I get in my car and I go to a new location, I put the destination in, and I get going. If my GPS doesn't know where my current location is, I'm never going to get to my intended destination. Same thing happens with us. If I want to move my arm and do a bicep curl, I first have to know where my arm is. So if my hand's down here on the table versus behind my back, it's completely different muscles that have to coordinate to get that job done, right? So the three systems that do that for us is, for one, your inner ear. Your inner ear has canals and fluid in them. And so every time I move my head, the fluid moves and it tells my brain, hey, you just moved your head to the right. You just moved your head to the left. So it gives you a good picture of where your head is in space. Next player is your neck. Your neck is really important because it tells you where is your head relative to your body, okay? So do this with me. If I turn my head to the right, and the camera's backwards, but if I turn my head to the right versus turning my body to the left, what's the difference there? How does my brain know the difference? Because technically, if I move my head to the right, in both situations, my chin ends up on my right shoulder, right? If I move my head to the right, my chin's on my right shoulder. If I move my body to the left, my chin's on my right shoulder. Both situations are similar to the neck because my neck's moving the same. However, when I move my head, and I just move my head alone, I get information from my neck, but I also get it from my inner ear saying I moved that way. When I move my body, my neck's the only thing that's moving. My head's stationary, so I don't get any information from my neck, from my ear. I'm only getting it from my neck. So my brain can differentiate the two and say, you just moved your neck that time and not your body, or not your head. The last player that's important here is your eyes, or your visual system. And your visual system tells you where are things in the environment relative to me. So if you're sitting in front of me and you move to my left, my brain has to say, did you move to the left or did I move to the right? And how it figures that out is it compares against those other two systems. So if I see something move in my environment, my brain says, hey, did you feel any information, get any signals from your inner ear or your neck? And if not, I know it was the environment moving, right? So that's how we have all these systems that should be working in unison for us to have a good picture of where we're at in space, right? So it's just like the situation, how I like to explain it is, let's say we've all been in the situation, right? Where you're at work and let's say you have 2 employees and y'all all have your own job to do that contribute to the greater good of this company succeeding, right? And what happens if one of those people is out sick or on vacation or whatever it may be? Now the other 2 people have to make up for that slack and do that other person's job in order for this company to succeed. So same thing happens here, is all 3 of these systems need to be working in unison, but oftentimes after concussion, one of these systems gets damaged, whether you whiplash your neck or you get a concussion where you actually damage your inner ear or you have some kind of visual dysfunction. So I would say probably the most common is whenever you damage your inner ear. And what happens is when those other 2 systems have to work a little bit harder, whether it be the neck getting really, really tight, leading to headaches in the head, or now my visual system starts working a little bit harder, so I start getting visual motion sensitivity and things start moving and I feel really dizzy. Those are all some examples of things that you can see. And it's important to find a provider that can distinguish between these 3 things because they all lead to different treatments, right? So some of the most common signs and symptoms, and these come from the post-concussion symptom scale, is obviously headache, nausea, vomiting, balance problems, dizziness, fatigue, trouble falling asleep, excessive sleep, loss of sleep, feeling drowsy, light sensitivity, noise sensitivity, irritability, sadness, nervousness, more emotional, feeling numbness or tingling, feeling slow or foggy, difficulty concentrating, remembering, visual problems. All these things are something that could happen after a concussion. And so it's important to have a provider that can be able to assess all these different things because, like I said before, if you have one provider that says that they treat concussion, but they do the same thing on everybody, there's just no way that you can get the best results by seeing somebody that does the same exact thing for everybody with all of these different symptoms, right? So I hope today that you're able to learn something about concussion. I hope it enticed you a little bit to want to learn more. If you have any questions, feel free to email me or message me on Instagram or Facebook, or drop them below. If you have any other topics that you'd like for us to discuss, drop them below. Other than that, I hope you have a great day. And I'll talk to you next time. Bye.